Blended Learning, a guide for high school teachers. Blended learning, the quick definition is exactly what it sounds like. It's face-to-face learning as well as online learning. So it's blended, you get both. Okay, there's 4 different models. There's lab rotation, which is where students are going back and forth between the classroom and the computer lab. It may look like that's all that's happening, but what they're doing in the computer lab is actually driving instruction in the classroom. There's the class rotation, which is just basically small groups going around. 2 of them are guided, one is with a teacher, and then one is with the online learning. The flex model is like a classroom and then has breakout rooms. And the pod model is where teachers are going to take on different roles. And it's more of, it could have students with different age levels, and I think of it more as a university type situation. The advantages, there are a ton of advantages for both students and teachers. For teachers, when you're doing blended, it's a lot easier because you're managing small groups at a time. You very rarely have your whole class, and it just makes it that much easier for classroom management, as well as teaching. If you're teaching to a small group, you can guide that group to be more about the same level academically, whereas if you're teaching to the whole group, you're kind of always teaching to the middle kids, and the high kids are usually bored and your low kids are usually barely hanging on, which leads into differentiation. Obviously, it's a lot easier to differentiate when you're working in small groups. It gives you a lot of opportunity for formative assessment. Since they're working online so often, it is so easy to just give them a quick Google form or find some other digital tools that give you that feedback. You're able to update your content and give a lot of supplemental materials with ease, especially with a lot of the learning management systems that we all have in place in our schools. And I've already touched on feedback. It's really easy to give feedback. It's also very easy to get feedback. So students can tell you, you can either have them self-reflect or have them reflect on what they're liking and disliking about blended, and then you can guide your teaching from that. The student advantages, there's a lot more engagement. They like that they're able to get real-time feedback, either quick and immediate with like a Google form that you give the answers, things like that, or maybe it's an online game or anything else that lets them know how they're doing. They also enjoy that they have control of time, place, and pace. Digital fluency, they're working on all of those skills that they're going to need in preparation for college, and they also get to take ownership of their own learning. That's similar to the controlling. A big part of blended is to make sure that students have control over something. It's not just saying, oh, I put on a YouTube video today, so there you go, I'm blended. That's not the situation. Students have to have some sort of control over their learning for it to be considered blended. The process can be different for everybody. For me, my process, I basically started by talking to our tech coach, getting started with HyperDocs, and then I started setting a plan in place and did 1 unit. I planned the whole thing ahead of time so that I had everything laid out exactly the way I wanted to do it, and I planned for 2 days of blended and 3 days in the classroom. I later on alternated that. Well, actually, I started with that and then ended up doing more time in the classroom and would do like half days classroom, half day blended. But got feedback from my students that they didn't like that because they didn't like to pack up their stuff to go to the library or vice versa to come back. And they felt like it was a waste of class time, which I also did. So later on, after getting that feedback, I did do every other day blended. So some weeks were 3 days blended, 2 days classroom. Other weeks were 2 days classroom, 2 days blended, 3 days classroom. And that has seemed to work out really well. The students then knew exactly what day they were on instead of always playing that guessing game. They definitely like the routine. They're always working on a hyperdoc to turn things in, which is also that routine. It keeps everything consistent for them. So a mini guide, this is tips for teachers. So if you are interested in starting blended learning, this is my advice for you. Start small. Definitely only do one chapter or one unit. And make sure it's like your next upcoming one that you can then put into place right away before you forget little things that you want to add or change. Collaborate if possible. We all know two heads are better than one. Whether you have a tech coach, an instructional coach, maybe it's just another teacher you'd like to work with, but try to collaborate or at least bounce ideas off of somebody. Try to use some sort of SAMR model or some sort of tech integration guide to make sure that you're using technology that's going to enhance student learning and not just replace necessarily what they're already doing. You want to make sure that what you're doing is going to be worthwhile for you and for them, especially if you're trying to build engagement. Set your rules and be consistent. There's still management involved. If your students are taking advantage or anything like that, you have to make sure that you are being extremely consistent in your rules. If you tell them, like for example, my students, I tell them if I find them disrupting people in the library, that they're going to lose lose their privilege to go to the library, and I have taken that privilege away. Same thing if their grades drop too low, I pull that privilege away, and I have to make sure I'm consistent on that. Otherwise, it's not going to work. Set up a plan for meetings with small groups. Another thing I found is that if I labeled my groups by colors or letters or whatever, and I set up a schedule of when I was meeting certain groups. Kids could fluctuate between groups depending on their level at that chapter, but I did find that was easier so that it was routine instead of me trying to hunt kids down to get them to come meet with me, and I was wasting class time and small group time for that. So it was definitely better to have that routine in place, as well as a set schedule. I've already talked about this. It was way easier to do every other day blended, or these 2 days or these 3 days, whatever you want to do that works for you. But it's definitely easier on everybody to have a schedule in place. And the last thing is make sure that you get feedback from your students to guide instruction and to reflect. I know it's a scary thing sometimes to let the students tell you how they feel about your teaching, but this was a really good eye-opener for me. That's actually how I came up with all of my schedules and my plans for my meetings, because they were the ones that were like, we don't know when you want us where, and sometimes our email doesn't come through right away, or our text messages from Remind doesn't come through right away, and then we miss something. So that was definitely an eye-opener for me. So don't be afraid of that feedback from your students.